Hello, and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I'm Anna.
And I'm Victoria.
We are excited to have you with us today. If you have been listening to our previous episodes, you know Victoria and I are educators who share a passion for reading and all things literacy. We recently noticed an uptick in research and opinions around what are the best practices when it comes to literacy instruction, specifically the role of phonics in literacy instruction. In an effort to better understand the newest research, we are interviewing experts from across the nation with expertise in literacy and multilingual education to have real discussions about how to support our students, specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate high school.
Today, we are excited to be chatting with Dr. Socorro Herrera, the Executive Director of the Center for Intercultural and Multilingual Advocacy at the College of Education and Kansas State University. So welcome, Dr. Herrera.
Well, thank you. Thank the two of you for having me today. I'm excited to share my experiences, my knowledge with each and every one of you, those listening and the two of you.
Well, we're excited to have you. And so before we dig into the meat, we're just kind of curious a little bit about that experience and how you came to really become this expert in literacy and multilingualism. So could you just tell us a little of your story?
Well, I have been forever chasing the question of what does it mean to teach reading and how is it that a learner acquires those skills, that knowledge to become a reader. I'm a migrant student, so I never started and finished school in any place my whole entire life. I'm an immigrant. I came to the U.S. when I was in fifth grade, and so already had a foundation in literacy, but it was interrupted, as some would say. And so I had those experiences, and I'm just going to say that I became a reader because of Nancy Drew and a teacher who said to me, "Don't worry that you're not in class. The whole world is out there, and you're going to get into this world by reading, and you're like Nancy Drew. She has all these exciting events and things that happen in her life, and she gave me the books, and it was just that relationship building, that exchanged with that one teacher that changed my life forever in reading. So then I became a teacher, and of course, because I'm a bilingual educator, I didn't go into a bilingual education classroom. I became a Title I teacher in reading in a rural school with migrant students. And I was given decodable books, and I was given very sequential ways of teaching reading when I pulled my students out of their classroom. But I remembered that that's not how I learned to read. And as Virginia Wilson, a colleague of mine, says, I noted my kids were withering on the vine, that I was teaching 3 to 6, 8 kids at a time, and they would just kind of like lay on the table. So I veered off to contextualize in their lived experiences, to bring humor, to really value their native language. And I saw them, rise to the occasion of being present to me and my being present to them. But I was always doing this in fear. I was a brand new teacher. And so my whole trajectory of professional life has been in literacy and just observing and experiencing the tension that exists about what framework is the one that we should use to teach reading. And so a kind of long explanation, but it's from the day that I entered a public school in the United States to present day that I am reflecting on what does it mean to teach reading to culturally and linguistically diverse students.
So much of what you just said is really resonating with me. First of all, I just have to give a shout out to Nancy Drew.
Yay.
Right? Like those stories, and it's about, thank goodness for that educator, and thank goodness for all the educators out there who look at our students and look at us as students and say, hey, I know what book might work for you. Right. Mm-hmm. And like making those connections. And if that book doesn't work, like trying another one. Right. And mm-hmm. So I have to give that shout out. Like that makes me so happy. But I also love the story that you tell about like that tension that we as educators feel. right? That we're hearing so many different things that sometimes seem to have friction between them. And so, what exactly do we follow? So, given all of your expertise and your research and your lived experience, what does effective literacy instruction look like and sound like in that classroom?
Well, we take the definition of literacy, and I'm taking this from Dr. Olson and Escamilla and Slavik in a paper they did for the National Council on Effective Literacy. Literacy is learning to communicate, read, and write as a means for expression to gain knowledge. So that's at the most fundamental level. What we as teachers understand in finding ourselves in a classroom with very diverse groups of students is that all of that communication and that expression is bound culturally and linguistically. We don't arrive at school without experiences. We don't arrive at school without comprehending what it means to exchange ideas and to communicate. We learn to express our needs within our own familial and community context. And so with this arrival and with these skills into public schooling, if the opportunity isn't present for us to be able to bring our own language, our own knowledge, our linguistic skills, our repertoire that we have available to us, you're basically devaluing me and my humanity and my culture and my experiences. And so when we bound literacy within culturally responsive pedagogy, which we talk about everywhere, we have to be able to value the native language. We have to set the conditions for that to occur. We have to situationally be present to the exchange of ideas, to the way the child is hearing the sounds, to the way they are interpreting the phonics and the structures of the language. And we have to revoice, we have to bridge, we have to connect. And, we must. I hardly ever use that in anything that I say, or we should. And yet, without the opportunity, without the revoicing, without the valuing of the native language, we are emptying a rich vessel of knowledge and skill that the student arrives with. And this is a child even with interrupted schooling. We have to redefine what it is that literacy means within our teaching context.
So, Dr. Herrera, can you expand on that redefinition? Because I think that teachers right now are struggling with, so what is it that I'm supposed to do as I move forward? New research is coming out. I know I'm not supposed to do this anymore. My district is asking me to do this. But when it comes to how are we supposed to redefine and what does that look like in my classroom? I'm a third grade teacher. I'm a first grade teacher. I'm an 11th grade teacher. I know I have multilingual students. I know I need to consider all of the assets that they bring into my classroom. And so then what does that look like for me as a classroom teacher when it comes to implementing a literacy that's based in good pedagogy?
And that's where the tension lies, because if I'm using a framework, and I'm going to use it in the, Haggerty, if I'm using Haggerty as the model that I'm utilizing to teach, and I'm using the script, and I have a child from Guatemala, El Salvador, Cuba, third generation, Latinx, and I am not providing that opportunity to breathe, to have a whiteboard on my lap as I'm going through that routine and saying, and how are you bringing meaning to this? Do you have any words available that might align with what it is that I'm teaching you? It's that opportunity for the child to truly connect to the linguistic repertoire that they have available, to the knowledge that they have available. So when I talk about withering on the vine, I oftentimes sit in classrooms as the teachers go through the phonics routine or the vocabulary routine. And the children start by beginning to fidget, and then they begin to stretch on the floor, and then they fall back, and you just see them unable to really take in the input. They don't. There's no that comprehensible input that we talk about. If I can't comprehend, how is it that I would be able to connect with you, to connect with the reading, to connect with the lesson?
And as a classroom teacher myself, I'm thinking back to those moments where we kind of sidestep, right? We're locked in. Of course, we're teaching our curriculum. We're doing what we're supposed to do as asked by the district. But in those moments where a student makes a connection or is trying to make a connection, we need to be able to sidestep and say, okay, yeah, so let's talk about that. And maybe I need to draw a picture. And then maybe that validation of that one student is going to spark a couple of other ideas. And now we're having a real conversation about a campfire. And so now I have multiple students making meaning around that specific word. But that ability to be able to do that, I think, is really important. And also the permission.
Yes, the permission. I work with so many teachers who feel like they don't have the permission. I was actually in a classroom one day where the principal walked in as the teacher was having this rich conversation about words that, she sidestepped. That's a beautiful way. She sidestepped and she asked all the students on the whiteboard to write a word that had the same pattern that she was teaching. And the kids were into it, and they were then talking about sentences, and there was this joy. There was this feeling of connection making, of culturally bound exchange. And the principal walked in, and her shoulders went back, and her whole demeanor changed, and I could feel it. And she picked up the book and tried to fumble through acting as if she was on the script. The kids bounced back pretty quickly, and when the principal left, I asked her, I said, "What was that about? Oh my gosh, the richness." And she said, "No, the district has asked that we stay with the sequence and not deviate." And she said, "I just don't want to make any trouble. Already some of my colleagues know that I do this and not very happy with me." And so I thought, it hurt, actually. I know it hurt her and it hurt me. Her scores also in the district were way above and beyond any of her peers, because she did a lot of that when the door was closed.
And I think that's a tough position that educators are in right now. Yeah. Can we take a minute to shift now from the classroom to that connection to families and partnership? So we know that, the stronger the partnership between families and school, the more engagement that we have and value. So how might schools and families partner together in consideration for their students' success in becoming more literate? And maybe what advice would you have for students for parents and families in supporting effective literacy at home?
I feel very strongly about this one, because the research often says that we have parents who don't read to their children, parents who are not literate. We stay in the deficit. We've stayed in the deficit for since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I'm writing a paper right now that actually is tracing back to where did these frameworks for reading begin? How were children taught to read way back when, the territories became part of the U.S. And we're always pushing out more books for the families, practice with decontextualized books, more flashcards. And we've lost sight, or we've never talked about, instead of pushing out, harvesting and bridging in. I think about the rich literacy practices that all families have. I've been in homes where the mother and father don't read, but can they sing mariachi music? Can they, do the rosary at night from beginning to end? This oral language development that is so rich. We very seldom harvest and link language. And so one of the activities that many of the teachers that I work with, is instead of sending the Ziploc bags with the books so that the parents can practice, knowing that their parents work at beef packing plants or in agriculture, and really sometimes it's a single mom, they send a picture that will help with comprehension and with vocabulary development. A few years back, it was one teacher, they were talking about the fall. It was in a first grade classroom, so she sent pumpkins, which was part of the book that they were required to read, and she sent 4 pictures, and then she left it really a canvas of open opportunity for the anyone in the family or a neighbor to sit with the child and talk about what they saw, what they felt, what they knew about. And sure enough, she got otoño. She had one that had everyone in the family took a crayon and wrote different words and had a conversation with the child. One parent actually turned it over to the back and wrote this whole thing about pumpkins and empanadas and the fall. And but there was this whole, you know, compilation of the experiences of all the families, of the words that all the families had available to them. From that, the teacher put them on the wall, and as she was reading the story, she said, "Oh, and Sophia's mother did this, and Jose's mother makes empanadas with pumpkins." And it was this weaving, this richness. And so the advice for me for teachers would be, put yourself in the middle of those children and those families. Go back to the roots and fertilize them. Los dichos, the music. If they're religious, what happens within that religion that is literacy bound? And then there's the very traditional homes that do read to their children. But we have to understand that root in order to build a strong trunk, in order to build branches within our communities, in order to harvest the fruit of the home, and then look at developing the English language and deepening that language development, uh, growing, harvesting beyond. It's what bilingualism and biculturalism and biliteracy is all about. We're failing still today to do that in schools. We come from a lens that our system, this is what you're supposed to know to be worthy, and we have lost sight of how much richness we have. And so we talk about culturally responsive pedagogy and the experiences and how it is that having those perspectives lead to effective teaching, but we still come from a frame of reference that's very systems bound. And in literacy, we're losing the battle, because of that.
So, Socorro, I love this imagery that you're painting for us of the agricultural, the plants, right? That we're growing, that we're rooting, that we're blossoming. And then we also have some people that are withering on the vines, right? And we need to figure out, how do we take away that withering? How do we make sure that we get the right nutrients, the right everything into that soil? So I want to go back to that teacher you talked about, the teacher that with the closed doors, that what happens behind the doors, and it's back to this whole idea that as educators, it's such a private industry, right? That the second another adult walks into our classroom, the first thing we do is stop teaching, right? Stop teaching, go tend to the other adult. How do we make sure that other adult can leave so we can get back to our art? But I want to talk about those educators that are finding themselves in schools and districts that have policies that are really creating obstacles for them to teach freely, right? And to celebrate what their students need. What sort of advice might you give those teachers, and so that they can really feel empowered and feel like they have the tools to sort of sidestep, right? Those, or have permission to sidestep and make sure that they're meeting their students' needs?
I always say you have to find the balance, and you have to create. So once you understand the context, the population you're teaching, the community you're teaching in, the parents that and the richness of what they have to offer within within literacy, you have to balance the priorities, and you have to look for strategic, what I call tools in the hand, that keep you in the routine, but that also allow that open canvas of opportunity. It can be a quick draw, a quick write. And they happen situationally. We can set the conditions, we can understand the context, but the discourse that happens in the classroom, the exchange of ideas, what kids produce in the moment that helps us to formatively assess whether they're getting. Let me give you an example of this. So there's a teacher that looks at whatever it is that she has to teach, the skill, the vocabulary, all of that. And she chooses things that she believes kids might be challenged by. So at one point, this teacher's teaching the short O sound, and one of the words is pod, P-O-D. So she just takes this chart paper and puts the word pod, gives everyone a Post-it note. It took no more than 3 minutes to do this. And she says to the kids, listen, close your eyes, listen to this word. And she does a mini lesson. And then she says, when you hear the word pod, what do you think of? Put it on your Post-it. And she had peas in a pod, Tide Pod, iPad, iPod. I don't remember all of them. I have a picture of it. And so then they laughed about peas in a pod. She made this whole list of words that came up. And then she came to iPad. And she said, iPad. And, child, actually there were 3 that said. And so then she did a mini lesson on pad and pod. And they had this whole conversation and what. And then she went on to teach the very scripted, but she kept going back to that and how it is that we hear things differently sometimes, and she did this whole lesson on language without missing a beat. So what I say to teachers, find the balance, find your priorities, and don't let go of the humanity that exists within our classrooms that's bound by language and culture. We can't devalue that. It doesn't go away in what it is that we do in our classrooms, and find the joy. Because what I see is that so many of the teachers that I work with are in this path that's getting ready to diverge to their frustration and leaving because they can't do what's right, or losing their own humanity if they stay. I feel pain. I hear in their voices. I see the closed doors. I see how policy, with its best intention, has impact that devalues, that is devastating, that is harmful to children. And I think of the districts in which I worked with for 25 years, ever since, Reading First and No Child Left Behind, who have had these models and these frameworks that haven't valued the culture and the language, whose scores have actually gone down. So we have to begin to reframe. We have to begin to explore new models, and we have to allow the teacher to be a professional. And yes, we do have some teachers that may need support, but I truly believe most teachers want to learn. If you start with the teacher's biography and the fears that they have, and provide the models and allow for the opportunities and the conversations, we will move forward.
So that's making me think about getting back to your why. Like, as a classroom teacher, whether you're a brand new teacher or you're a veteran teacher like us, why did you get into teaching? And most of us got into teaching because we want to work with kids, whether that's a 5-year-old kid or an 18-year-old kid, right? Like, to us, they're students, and have connections with students and make impact and help them to grow themselves. And if we remove the ability to make connections with students and we stay in that very scripted lane without the ability to sidestep into students' lives, then we remove that connection. And for a lot of us, that is removing the why of why we got into this, right? Mm-hmm. So we really need to stay connected to our own roots, as you're kind of making these analogies back to plants and going with what Victoria was saying, but in our own roots first of why we got into teaching and what we're trying to do, which is grow good humans, right? And while at the same time honoring and doing what we're supposed to do so that we don't get into trouble. So I love that.
Well, because I do believe that the five components and what we have in reading has its place. It does support us in framing, but we have to sidestep because we're not working with monolingual students who are English speaking, who understand the vocabulary. You know, I watched a group of Salvadorian, Guatemalan, Mexican uh, children in a classroom from indigenous communities, or at least 70%, learning about reading a story about a dog who was a mayor. I couldn't even really truly connect. I was like, so how
I
do
think I know that book.
you do know that book? And it was a whole week on that. And I was like, so I use the withering on the vine because Virginia Wilson did such a beautiful job in using that analogy, and in the tree and everything, because I sit in a lot of classrooms where I see some fabulous teaching, by the way. The sidestepping is happening, and
Mm-hmm.
some teachers are doing this amazing, phenomenal job. But in classrooms that are not, I see the kids and I almost can see like their arm droop, their head droop. But then I know that they are, falling off the vine because they'll flop over on the desk and put their head on the book. I mean, you can see it with kindergarten children in circle time. You see them all get and start, and then they begin to do that. They begin to poke each other, and then they fall back on their backs. It's just, I would love, but you can't ever get permission to just in silence, just watch kids, and then put on the audio of what the teacher was teaching, because you do see them withering on the vine. It's like they're not being fertilized, they're not being watered, they're not getting sunshine. They're not feeling that joy that you get when you walk out and you feel the sun hit you. I mean, you just not.
I know exactly what that withering on the vine looks like. And trust me, as a secondary teacher, it doesn't look that different with 18-year-olds than it does with the 5-year-olds, right? I mean, the one big difference is they have the hoods. When you start to see
Yep.
more and more hoods go on in your classroom, they're all starting to wither a little bit. So, going back to Anna and the why, I think one of Anna's and my big whys is that we believe that teachers of reading are readers themselves, right? And teachers of
Mhm.
writing are writers themselves. And so we really want to celebrate more about what you're currently reading or writing. Now, you gave us a little glimpse at what you're writing. You can either share some more about that or tell us personally or professionally something you're reading right now.
Well, I am looking at Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, which I read as an undergraduate. Changed my whole thinking in life, and just because it explores that conflict in identity and heritage and borderlands, which is tied to the whole history of bilingual education and reading that I'm also kind of connecting. Because I really do believe that when we deprofessionalize what teachers can do in the classroom, when they don't attend to the humanity, to the community, to the teachers, not because it isn't within us. That's why we became teachers, but because we have these policies and these models are that are so strict, that kind of come in as the blanket that everyone has to be on the same page at the same time for 20 minutes every single day. um, I take away students' identity. I create this internal conflict. I devalue the language. And as a teacher, that's what I mean. That do I want to let go of that humanity that is part of reading? And then my last favorite one is Howard Zinn's "You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train." I love that because in the work we were doing, we cannot be neutral. I wish I had a way to say to teachers, I'll give you an example. So Tori Clark, I was interviewing her. She's a fourth grade teacher in one of the districts that I work in. And we were I was asking her, how is it that you're not afraid? You just sidestep, and I love being in your classroom. I could be in your classroom all day long, every single day, learning. I said, how do you circumvent the system? How do you work within the system? And she said, because as a teacher, every day when I walk into my classroom, I remind myself, I am the system. And if I don't do what's right for my students, I am being part of the system that is not right. And I was like, whoa, we are the system. We need to find within ourselves that how do we lift ourselves up and just, oh, it doesn't feel good, but I'm going to push.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So our last question is one that we ask all of our guests because we're just so curious as readers. And you mentioned that you're reading Borderlands again. And, sometimes we go back to the same books over and over for different purposes. So do you have an all-time favorite book? Maybe one that you read over and over?
I think it would be Borderlands. It feeds my soul. It feeds my spirit. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely put that one in the show notes so that our listeners can check it out as well.
And, in the show notes, we're going to link to all of these amazing research points that Dr. Herrera has mentioned. We really want to thank you, Socorro, for being with us today. We feel like we've learned so much, had a great conversation with you. And really, you've given us a lot to think about as to that growing, right? And how can we make sure that we're nurturing and giving all of the right fertilizer and all of the right nutrients to our classrooms, right? And not only to our classrooms, but to the whole community of our schools. And so that we're really building as a team and we're not working as that individual locked in our classroom. So thank you for listening. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. For more information and to get access to those resources mentioned, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.